I hope I don't disappoint you too much, but I've changed lecture topics. I'm changing tomorrow night's and tonight's lecture topic because I felt I need to deal more generally with trauma and trauma theory before we deal specifically with dealing with adolescents. I apologize to those of you. It was mentioned last night that I would be dealing with spirituality and treating families in crisis, but we didn't mention that was a switch. And so I apologize to those of you who were there. Of course, those of you who only wanted to hear adolescents, maybe you'll come back tomorrow night. Spirituality is a widely used term with many, many meanings, and I want to really talk about the presence of the Holy Spirit as our spirituality. And the presence of the Spirit of God in ministering to families in the midst of a trauma. And I want to summarize for you a bit of pastoral theology and a foundation for doing that. And I want to think of family trauma probably a little further down the scale than most of us think of family trauma. It is a trauma when there's an illness in the family. It's a trauma when we have a major change, when someone flunks the second grade in school, when we lose a job. Those kinds of traumas certainly bring enough pain. But I'm not talking about that kind of family trauma. I'm talking about the death of a child. I'm talking about permanently being dismembered. I'm talking about the total loss of the home. Maybe someone's lost their sight or their hearing permanently. An automobile accident where 2 or 3 family members do not survive, a fire where there's the death of a child, a major trauma, the kind of event where the family says for the rest of their life, there was life before that day and there's life after that day. In a, now I would say, mild kind of way, certainly didn't feel that way when it happened to us. Our family experienced that when I was 14 years old. My father was in a cave-in the mines and lost his left arm. He and I fished, and we would go hunting and do so many things together that he could no longer do with the kind of ease that he had before. It was a good 18 months to 2 years that our family went through the adjustments of that. I didn't understand it. It was painful back then, but that's the kind of trauma on the mild side that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And my working hypothesis is that the presence of the Spirit of God through a minister or through caring Christian communities are essential, or the presence is essential in treating the family in crisis. And I would like to suggest that the presence of the Spirit, we have learned in pastoral theology for many years, can be the foundational moving force in care and ministry. And in the first place, when there's a trauma, what the family is wanting and what we as a representative of God begin to bring is some aspect of healing. That we are agents of healing when we come representing the Spirit of God in the midst of trauma. And they look with hope, they look with expectation that we will bring this wholeness. Now, at that time, early in the trauma, they are probably conceptualizing that as a return to life before. And that's not likely to happen. Sooner or later, they're going to realize that it's not going to be the way it was before. But we hold out healing and wholeness as a goal. While at Menninger, I interviewed several persons who had been through major trauma and for whom their spiritual life had been a resource. One mid-40s woman had lost both kidneys to disease, and while she was on dialysis and on the transplant list, was diagnosed with cancer and was taken off the transplant list. It had been 2 years since she had learned that she would have to wait 5 years before she could be back on the transplant list again and be cancer-free before she could be considered a candidate. We met weekly for an hour, and she would tell her story, and she would talk, and we would talk about what the Spirit of God had meant in her life, and a particular chaplain who had walked with her through the early days of that experience. And she said after 4 or 5 weeks of our talking, Wade, If I had to give up my new relationship with God in order to get my kidneys back, I wouldn't do it. Because you see, I'm a more whole person now than ever in my lifestyle before I was stopped in my tracks with my disease. That's a different kind of healing, but it's the kind of healing that we bring and that we hold out to persons in the midst of trauma and tragedy. We hold out a vision of wholeness, and we, represented in the Holy Spirit, speak openly about healing. But many, many times, as Stuart Hiltner pointed out, healing isn't going to happen, or at least not now, and our ministry in the presence of the Spirit is a ministry of sustaining. We are caring for them. We are an environment that sustains them, gives them hope. We are an environment that says to them, we'll bear your burdens with you. And through the ministry of presence, we make the tragedy more bearable. We are simply there to sustain them. We recognize that total restoration is not likely, but we are still there, not knowing necessarily which direction we're going, not knowing what the future is going to hold, but simply being there to help hold things together. Many, many times in the time of trauma, persons are confused, bewildered, their meaning in life is shattered, and we are there in the third place as instruments of guiding. We're to bring the Word of God. We're to bring the sensitive movement of the Spirit. We're to bring our own insight and their insight as a way of clarifying decisions for them. A way that begins to bring some pattern, some meaning, some understanding out of the chaos of the trauma. Guiding means assisting in, but not making decisions for other people. Calling them toward hope. And we are there to help guide. Many, many times, as tragic as an event might be, even more tragic is the response of brokenness of the family members toward each other. You can probably think of a given grief in a family when perhaps a grandparent or a parent passed on, and then the family got to fighting with each other that they made it so much worse. The anger and the grief, the brokenness in the response to the trauma, the blaming each other for, I thought you were watching the child, I thought you were watching the child. How could this happen? That kind of anger and blaming tears the family apart, and as representatives of the Spirit of God, we come with a fourth kind of ministry, and that's the ministry of reconciliation. We come to reconcile the broken family members one to another. We come to reconcile persons who are struggling with their own guilt to themselves and to God. We come as agents of reconciliation that we might bring wholeness in the process again. Sometimes we come to families in trauma, and they're in the midst of denial. I can think of an individual who was drowning himself in alcohol after the death of his son, talking about taking his own life, being totally irresponsible in his response, and having to say to him, you're making this much worse. There's a time in the name of the Spirit we have to do some honest confronting. And that's not easy. I think sometimes we as ministers are willing to confront generally, but one-on-one we have trouble saying, thou art the one. We have trouble helping persons see how their own participation in the pattern is making things worse. And I think in the presence of the Spirit, we have to ask for the courage to confront. This doesn't mean confronting people with our own particular way of looking at life. It means confronting persons with the truth of the gospel and with the truth of the Scripture, and perhaps drawing out their own sense of moral value and letting them confront themselves. We're a mirror in front of them. And then in the sixth place, there are times in the midst of family trauma and crisis when we come in the presence of the Spirit to give them new information. New information about God. You may simply say to them, the God I worship didn't kill your baby. There are others who would see God differently from what you're saying. You don't want to get in a big argument with them, but simply inform them of other options. Inform them of other ways of looking. This is not to be misunderstood as taking over their life and giving advice and moving them through it. This is to inform them about life itself. Well, as we're involved as agents of the Spirit in healing, sustaining, guiding, reconciling, confronting, and informing, we begin to move with families in the midst of trauma in a unique kind of way as representatives of the Spirit. Now, early on, we need to do some assessing. And I would like to suggest that the 7 factors from last night would be a good starting place to look at what it is we're working with in this family. That when we're ministering with a family in trauma, and we're trying to do so from a religious perspective, that we stop and ask about those 7. Now, I'll not give you a pop quiz like I would do in my class, but I bet some of you could name all 7 of them. But you will remember that we talked about their commitments to each other, their communication, their problem-solving ability, the fact that they worship together, the fact that they can give and receive affirmations with each other, the fact that they spend quality time together, that they are flexible. We talked about families that have a sense of resilience built into them. And when you're beginning to minister to a family, you need to know what kind of strength you have there before you begin the ministry process. I remember, for example, asking a young 16-year-old, as we were talking about the trauma she had been through, if God meant anything to her in this process. She said, "I don't think so." And one of the techniques of counseling that I had learned early was to ask persons to identify with a character in the Scripture and see if they want to tell you something about themselves. So I said to this young lady, I said, "Who's your favorite Bible character?" This was well down into the interview. And she quickly said, "Oh, Jesus." I thought, identifying with a character, and so it's to be followed. And I said, "And why would it be Jesus?" She said, "It's the only person in the Bible I know." Well, drawing upon the religious strength of that person was not going to be an easy task. We need to know what kind of family we're dealing with. There are families in the midst of trauma, and we begin to talk to them, and they say, "Oh, you can't say that to my mother. You can't talk that way to my father." And you realize that they have major communication barriers in the family. And without that kind of strength, there's not going to be any ministry. So take those 7 as kind of a template that you would put over the family before you begin to minister to them in the time of trauma. Now, given that you know where you're going to be coming from, you know your theological foundation, you know the kind of family you're moving with, then we begin to look at the context of the family and the trauma so we can begin to evaluate what we're doing before the actual intervention. And there's some things about the trauma that you need to know. Some things about the event that make a difference. The overall impact of a given trauma results from an assortment of influences. As tragic as the death of a child would be, it can be worse or better depending on some of the characteristics. And you would know that the family's method of coping with trauma, coping with stress, contributes to their own stability or vulnerability. Some families, when the trauma happens, are already in the mode of solving problems. They can do things together. They have many resources, and it's not going to be as difficult for them. Other families have difficulty making basic decisions about where are you going to eat on Sunday. You know, they get in the car after church on Sunday and say, "Where do you want to go?" "Well, I don't know. Where do you want to go?" And they can't make simple decisions without squabbling with each other. Those families obviously are going to be more seriously impacted by trauma. We don't have a careful measurement. There's no litmus test. There's no thermometer. There's no way to measure. But in some way, we need an assessment of what I call the family's accumulated pile-up of stress. You know, people talk about, you ask them how they're doing, and they will say, "Well, you know, my head's barely above water." Or they'll say, this is a great day, I'm bouncing right along. We need some indicator of the emotional pileup or the stress that the family was in before this. We need to do some history taking. There's never a good time for a tragedy to strike, but there are some worse times for a tragedy to strike. And you need to know what they're dealing with. There are families that have had 3 or 4 or 5 major death experiences in the family system within the last 6 or 8 years. There are other families for whom everything has been going quite well, and there's not this level of emotional pileup. In addition to the emotional pileup and the coping mechanisms, the internal and contextual resources of the family provide strength when they're facing a crisis. For example, their educational level, their ability to communicate with other professionals, with the physicians, with any legal persons there, their connections within the community. Corporate gypsies are particularly vulnerable to crisis in their family. You know, corporate gypsies, the families that are moved every 2 or 3 years up the corporate ladder, and they're never any place long enough to have a real sense of rootedness in a community. They are more vulnerable to family crisis than families that have lived in a community for a number of years. So their connections within the community, their economic means. There are some families for whom the crisis is more difficult because they simply don't have the means to respond. You know persons that simply don't have cab fare back from the hospital. The professionals within the community. There are good communities in which to have a heart attack, and there are bad communities in which to have a heart attack, simply because of the professionals that are there. There are good communities in which to have a marital crisis. There are good communities and bad communities for many types of tragedies and different professionals within the community. All of these assets that I'm talking about, educational level, connections in the community, economic means, they all contribute to the pool of assets that you're beginning to assess when you're ministering to a family in trauma. And finally, another of the factors you'll want to assess is the family's ability to know what's going on, to appraise the situation. If they're in denial, if they really don't know what's happening to them, they're not going to be able to address creative options. They're not going to be able to find coping devices. They're not going to be able to adjust to the trauma. Sooner or later, somebody in the family has to be able to say with Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, we are not in Kansas anymore. This is not Kansas. And there are families that just don't seem to know what's going on. I remember calling a family and telling them that their 16-year-old daughter needed for us to come and have a conversation with them. And the father said, well, Wade, you're scaring me to death just to say that we're going to do this. And I said, I can imagine that. He said, can you tell me what's going on? And I said, I've really promised her that she can tell you what's going on. And you might guess what we were going to say. But we got there. Father and mother was there. We sat down in their living room, and she said, Mom and Dad, I'm pregnant. And the mother began to cry, say, what are we going to do? I sat there for 30 minutes, and the father did not speak a word. Didn't say a thing. And finally I said to him, Glenn, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? He said, it just doesn't seem real. Are you sure you're pregnant? He said to her. She said, of course I'm sure I'm pregnant. I'm 4 months pregnant. That's why we're here to tell you. And he said, well, I've got some phone calls to make. And got up and walked out of the room. He didn't know he thought he was still in Kansas. He didn't know he was in nowhere land. They need to be able to make an assessment of what's going on. To his credit, he called me later that night. And he said, tell me what I'm supposed to do. Tell me what I'm supposed to feel. He said, he really couldn't assess what was happening in the process. He did begin to respond, and he was there for his daughter later on. But initially, he couldn't appraise the situation. He didn't know what he was facing. After we assess what a trauma means, and the family assesses that, then the next thing they begin to assess is the future. What does this mean for my lifestyle? If you've been through a heart attack or a major illness, you know how something like that can change the rest of your life. And you have to begin to assess, well, what are we facing? And then what can we do with the options that are before us? The context of the family, the overall impact of the trauma have to be assessed before we can begin to minister. The nature of the event itself has to be assessed. In working with 30 traumatized families last year, I soon realized that the more unique the event appeared, the less able they were to cope. It's strange, but misery does love company, even in the midst of trauma. If the entire community flooded, the victims seemed better able to cope when they could lean on each other than if just one house was destroyed by fire. There was something in the community aspect of the trauma that made it easier to survive. And persons who felt they were singled out and that this had happened just to them felt more stress and had fewer resources for recovery. Another factor that I think you would guess is that an unexpected tragedy smashes the defense with more force than a predictable tragedy does. We never expected anything like this could happen to us. The pastor and his wife reported when their 13-year-old daughter was kidnapped, raped, and murdered by an escaped convict, riding her bicycle 3 blocks down the street in a quiet Kansas community. Totally unexpected. That's radically different from a family whose 13-year-old daughter has just died after 2 years of struggle with leukemia. Not that they don't grieve too, but the unexpected nature accentuates the pain and the tragedy. There's simply no preparation. And there's a sense in which persons accept trauma if it's a part of the developmental process. It's easier when there's no developmental deviation. For example, if an 80-year-old dies at the end of 3 years of illness, that's different from an 8-year-old dying at the end of 3 years of illness. Families would say over and over again, they're so young, or it's not right that this would happen at their time in their life. And in some unique kind of way, persons that would die the day before graduation in a car wreck, it was different than the day after graduation. There was a sense of incompleteness about it that made the crisis somehow even worse. Why now? Why our child? The extensiveness of the consequences of the trauma escalated their overall anguish. We lost all 3 of our children, rather than 3 out of 4, one family said. Another family said that was all of our life savings, but also our son's college education. Both mom and dad were killed in the fire. We could have lost one. There's a sense in which the extensiveness of it adds to the trauma. And all of these events that I mentioned are things that we need to assess and begin to look at how we're going to work with this family over the next several years. The centrality of the trauma, as it relates to the person or the family, expands the stress. What I mean here is someone who loses a hand may or may not be totally disorganized depending upon how they make their living. What will I do without one finger? Could be a pianist response. I had an uncle who lost a finger in a mine and said, well, it's no big deal. The centrality of the loss to the person's life really makes a difference. If a dancer suddenly stumbles and cannot walk, it's much different than an accountant. They'll both be affected, but the centrality of the trauma to the person's lifestyle is a major difference. And the perceived permanence of the nature of the trauma robs families of hope and distress. No amount of rehabilitation will ever help me walk again, one young man in a wheelchair said. Had a student in my class who had for 9 months been in a trauma, age 17, teenage car wreck. Families told them, just give up. One woman came and said to the mother, I don't know what you've done, but there's some sin in your past that God's punishing you for this. And that poor woman sat down and wrote everything she could remember that she would call sin from the time she was 9 years old, and confessed them one by one over the next 2 months, and her son was still in a coma. And she was so angry that pastor came back, and she cursed him. She said, "It wasn't my sin. I don't know what it was." And in her testimony, John's mother said, finally, one of the fairly inactive members of the Sunday school class got around to coming to visit in about the 7th month. And he said it was awkward and he didn't know what to say. And he knew we had no hope that John was going to come out of this trauma. And he just walked in and put his arms around me and began to cry. And he said, "I don't know what to say, but I'm sure glad this didn't happen to me." And you think, what a crude thing to say. And she said, "Thank you." She said, "That's the most honest response I've had from anyone down at the church. I'm glad it didn't happen to you either." That man came back, and fortunately for them, in the 9th month, the son did come out of the coma, and he had some partial rehabilitation. He could use one hand and his brain. He had made his way through the University of Louisville. He made his way through Southern Seminary. And he wants to be a minister to persons with paralysis. He wants to be a rehabilitation chaplain. Because he says, "I think I can bring them some hope." He said, "So many times I was told there's no hope for any future for your life." In the midst of hopelessness, we begin to bring the presence of the Spirit of God, and we find hope in new ways. I'd like to suggest ways that we can minister to these families, whatever the specific trauma. I'd like to suggest ways that we can come in the presence of the Spirit and begin to intervene and begin to move toward healing and wholeness. First of all, I think the most important thing you can do is to be present. Immediately become present in body and in spirit. And if you can't be there physically, call on the phone. As soon as you know of the trauma, make a contact. Don't wait until you know what to say. Hopefully you're going to be trained to know something to say. And if you don't know what to say, say, "I don't know what to say. I just wanted to be here." Your presence is so important to them. Representing God's care demands that you're there, that you make time and take time. I recently read the diary of a chaplain from Emory Hospital. And she had a line that said, "I don't know why I continued to go to little Sarah's room. We all knew Sarah was going to die and die soon. But I would sit there by her window while she slept, because it seemed to mean something for that child to wake up and see the minister in her room." The ministry of presence may be the most important thing you can do. You don't have to be there to say anything. You just have to be present. And when you're not present in body, you have to be present in spirit. The family needs to know and think, the people in my church, the Christians in my life, the ministers want to be here with me. They need to know that you are walking through. To her, to that little girl, God was there as long as the chaplain was in the chair. Now, I know you all are busy, but there are few things that can justify being absent when a brother or sister in the midst of a life-changing crisis and you represent the presence of God to them. We simply have to be there. We simply have to be there. Or someone has to be there representing the church. When you're there, long hours of saying nothing, weeping, embracing, simply being there, sooner or later they're going to want to say some things. And some things that maybe aren't so nice. I found that a second form of ministry to families in trauma is to give permission for the forbidden, taboo thoughts and emotions to be voiced right there in my presence. To say, it's okay. Whatever you're thinking, to say it right now. God can hear that. To let them contend and wrestle with God and with the angels and whatever thoughts are in their mind, and to bless that process. It's frightening. It's frightening to hear the full fury of the rage of a family that's just lost their child. One friend said, I just prayed silently that God wouldn't strike them dead while they were expressing that. But I knew in my heart that God would be there for them. Give persons permission to even be angry with God and to say that. Give them permission to talk about their guilt. I wonder if our own lack of moral conviction, and they could be A, B, C, whatever they want to mention after that, really is the cause of this. Is God punishing us for something? They need a place to say that, a safe place. And you need to be that presence with them. And you need to hear that, to be a container for that. You become kind of their toxic waste dump. You're a place where they can deposit that, and you're going to take it off and let it go. You dispose of it properly. But you let them get it out. They don't have to live in it. They don't have to continue to suffer in it. And it may not be a one-time experience. In addition to being present and to being a container for their taboo thoughts and feelings, we need to create a sanctuary for private sharing by listening to their heart at the depth level. Have you ever been with someone that you knew was hanging on your every word just in a private conversation with them? Isn't that a gift? Isn't that a gift? Someone who's hungering and thirsting to listen to you, that's what you need to become to them. Not to be preoccupied, not to worry about having an answer, but to really give yourself to explore the depths of their uniqueness and the depths of their pain and their trauma and their tragedy and how unexpected it was and all of the things we've talked about. Now, some of you walk in and out of the funeral home so regularly that it's commonplace. Funerals aren't alike. Grief's not the same. Rather than looking at how general all of these experiences are, give yourself the task of finding out how unique each person's trauma is for them. What's their individual, unique, special response in this trauma? Listen and listen and listen. Become an interpersonal sanctuary for their hurt and their pain. Most victims need our empathy much more than they need any answers that we can give them. Much more than they need our scriptural blessings. They need our heart, linked to their heart in the midst of this. We need to care for their soul as if it is a gifted treasure from God. And in our presence, they feel that sanctuary. They feel that they can come to us as one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. And they'll find a presence of God that begins to meet that. Also, we need to encourage the victims to embrace trauma with realistic hope rather than withdrawal from the trauma or submitting as helpless victims to the trauma. We are there to care, we are there to be present, but we are there to hope, and sooner or later in the process, maybe 6 days, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 6 months, maybe 6 years, we begin to share a vision. We begin to ask, what are you going to do about this? Will you stay in this trauma forever? Will there be any hope? Realistic appraisal can be assisted by others and by professionals, and we are not there to deny that, but we are there in the process to ask, where is hope in the midst of this trauma? Where is hope in the midst of this trauma? One of the ways that I set about doing my research on ministering to traumatized families was to read the biographies of individuals who'd been traumatized and dared to write about it. And one was a book given to me by Meredith Titus, clinical psychologist at Menninger, that had helped her. It was called Flying Without Wings. Arnold Beezer graduated from medical school, was a professional level tennis player, and within 6 months was paralyzed from the neck down. He was one of the last victims of polio in the United States. Shots were available. He simply hadn't had his. 3 years in an iron lung. He said, I would have killed myself daily had I had the movement of even one arm. The despair was so great. No hope. Had trained in medical school, had paralyzed. Where would you find hope? What could he do? Salvation began to come to him in the tender care of one of his nurses, who began to minister to him in a deeper kind of way. And as he tells the story, he talks about beginning to find hope in conversations with her. Just hoping that she would be on duty and come back. It was a different kind of hope for him. Then he said, can you imagine my agony and my pain when I realized I was falling in love with Rita, an able-bodied person who was simply there to care for me, and I had nothing to offer her? Nothing to offer her. Could I dare hope? He said, then my despair returned, and I was ready to suicide again. He said, with fear and trembling, Rita said to me one day, there's something I've got to tell you. If you never see me again, I will understand. Said the agony of those next 2 seconds. A tear came to her cheek, and she said, Arnold, I'm not very professional, but I've fallen in love with you. He said, I laughed for the first time in 4 years. He said, you're kidding. You're in love with me? I was thinking, and I can tell you. He said, talk about hope. Talk about hope. Well, because of the advancements in technology, he was able to be out of the iron lung and on oxygen. He would have 2 or 3 days hours a day when he could be out, and they married. Then he began to think in his time out, 2 or 3 hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours. I have a medical education. Yes, it's 6 years old. And he said to her one day, you know what I want to do? And she said, no. He said, I want to do a residency. And he's paralyzed. She said, you can't do a residency. He said, I can become a psychiatrist. He said, all I'll need to do is use my head. And it works fine. 12 years later, he was the medical director of a psychiatric hospital in San Francisco. Hope in the midst of hopelessness. I don't know what form it will take, but we are to be symbols of hope when all else seems hopeless. Balancing one's view of oneself is another major problem. Because trauma, first of all, changes the way we see ourselves. Arnold said, I was no longer a man for a while. I remember my father talking about the loss of his arm and offering to divorce my mother. Surprised her, said, I'll leave because you may not want to be married to a one-armed man. Trauma attacks our own sense of self. And we have to be persons who help call forth the courage to be a new self and still be an okay self with traumatized persons in the family. We have to help them see the deeper definitions of self. We have to help them acknowledge the trauma admit the vulnerability, but then respect themselves as that changed person. Sherry Register, in her book, Living with Chronic Illness, talks, and she had an enlarged liver, a condition that couldn't be cured, talks about what it did to her image when she was with a group of professionals at University of Minnesota, where she had, I think, finished her own PhD. And a doctor was talking about having been at the hospital where she was diagnosed. And it was a social event. And finally, he turned and looked at her across the room and said, "I remember you. You're the enlarged liver." And she said, "It's as if my body were transparent. And they were going to see this huge diseased organ walking around the room. And I felt like one." And she went on to say, later at an appropriate time, she said to him, "No, I'm not the enlarged liver. I'm Sherry Register. Don't ever forget that." We need to give persons the courage to stand and say that. The renal dialysis patient who had lost both kidneys that I was talking about before has done a videotape on the physician's care of their patients. And she tells a story there about being on dialysis and in the unit, and she heard a doctor talking about the need to redo the shunt in her arm, and also the doctor was going to have to do another type of surgery, and then he was going to, I don't remember what the third thing he was going to do, but he said to the nurse, I'll do the surgery first, and then I'll do the arm, and then I'll do such and such. And when he came to her, she looked at him and she said, "Doctor, what is my name?" He said, "I don't know, it's there." He said, "Well, I want you to know it from now on, because I am not the damned arm. I don't want to ever be the arm to you or any anatomy or any part of my body. I want to be a name." You know, Daniel went to the lion's den because he didn't want to change his name. When you go to minister, know that self by name and use that name and communicate the dignity of the self. Even if the person is paralyzed from the neck down, always respect them as a whole person and know them as a person and communicate in a way that you enhance their view of self. That they're a special guest anytime you come into their presence. And you begin to call forth their courage to live that specialness. The first stage of adjustment in post-traumatic stress is accepting oneself as still being an okay person. Next, one begins to accept the future and all of its possibilities and all of its pain and all of its dignity. It may be that the last thing they have to control is their attitude toward the trauma. But you can be there to encourage that attitude toward health and wholeness. After they've experienced the shift of who they are, then we begin to enable them to elect an approach toward recovery. That in and of itself is a decision of hope. To begin to say to a family or to an individual, you have a choice in how you're going to attempt to respond or recover from this. You can elect an approach. You can choose to be bitter. You can choose to try to deny God. You can choose to be distant and isolate yourself. You can choose to struggle with people again. You can choose to stay at home, or you can choose the embarrassment of seeing persons for the first time in your condition. Whatever it is, you can elect an approach from here. That's within your power. Now, convincing persons of that is a major step in ministering to families that have been through a trauma. So many are going to say there's only one response, there's only one thing, and that's not true. Electing an approach involves choosing the attitudes toward the event, involves demonstrating a sense of able-heartedness, a sense of patience, a sense of endurance, a sense of optimism and a sense of being responsible for one's own future. And when we, as ministers of the gospel, can bring that kind of hope to persons, we can be agents of transformation in the midst of the most God-forsaken tragedy in their life. We can be there for them. They can elect a response. And when we communicate that, life looks different. Arnold, again, was able to be out in a wheelchair after 15 years. He and Rita were married. And he tells that they had very few pleasures, but guess what he really enjoyed doing most? Remember, there was no feeling except here. He enjoyed eating. I mean, he could taste great foods, and he enjoyed eating. He said, I didn't have to worry. He said, my body was so atrophied. He said, it didn't do anything. He said, I could eat all I wanted. They went to a fine restaurant in San Francisco. They had a motorized van and all the equipment, and because of the economic means, and remember, I mentioned that's one of the factors. They could have personalized care, and they could have everything he needed. But she put him in the wheelchair and went to park the car, and he realized the chair was beginning to creep. The restaurant was on a hill in San Francisco. He couldn't move his hands. As the chair began to roll down the hill, people began to scream. He looked down and realized it was nearly 100 foot to the bottom, down the slope. There were cars down there. He said, I was going to crash. Nothing I could do about it. They couldn't catch me. He said, suddenly I realized this was what it must be like to ski. He said, then it dawned on me, thank God, I'm paralyzed. I don't feel a thing. He said, I'm going to crash. I'm probably going to break my legs. I'm probably going to bleed. They'll pick me up. I won't hurt at all. He said, about halfway down, I got a smile on my face. I could barely lift one hand a little bit, and I went, whee! And crashed to the bottom. Said, everybody comes running in. Rita said, you fool. He said, I never could have had that much fun. I never could have had that much fun. Take me to the hospital. He said, I could look down. He said, I could see bone protruding through the skin. He said, I couldn't feel anything. He said, I was going to be okay. He said, so that sense of lightness and he said, that sense of humor just filled me in a fresh kind of way. He said, I'm there in the hospital room. They didn't have to give me any anesthetic. I couldn't feel it. You know, they're working on me. He said, this young intern, full of himself down there, oh, we're going to get this. He said, I looked, I said, excuse me, do you think I'll be able to walk again? And the young doctor fell for it. He said, well, of course you will. And then he said, well, that's great. He said, I've been paralyzed now for 18 years, and you're going to make me walk again. That's the ultimate in being able to elect one's attitude and approach toward what's happening in life. We can elect. We can choose. What good news. Furthermore, we enable the recovery when we begin to assist them in developing new skills for the journey. When we begin to assist them to look at new ways of living. It was years before my father said it, but he once said to me, you know, son, I think losing my arm was one of the most fortunate things that happened to me. Because I went back to college and I got an education and I began working in a different kind of way. There's no telling what might have happened to me had I stayed in that mind. And I know I wouldn't have learned the things about life and about people and about you all had I not gone back to school. Discovering new possibilities and new skills. What do you want to do now that you can't do what you were going to do the rest of your life? Enabling recovery involves assisting them to re-equip themselves. Beyond pity, beyond rage, beyond having been through the most unthinkable event that you can think of, there is still hope and a new life and new possibilities. And when you, as a minister of the presence of God, can communicate that to persons, then you can begin to facilitate their recovery from unthinkable trauma. Persons who recover enlist support and build a team around them. You remember last night when I talked about the 9 out of 29 families that survived the death of a child? The one common, those 9 that survived, was they had a support group. A Sunday school class, Compassionate Friends, which is a group of a parent support group for those who've lost a child by death, neighbors, persons who came. Few persons recover. Neighbors, persons who came. Few persons recover if they try to go it alone. Hammer, pound, knock the door down, do whatever it takes, but touch that person in a human kind of way so that they can begin to expand through family and friends and help groups the resources that they have. 2 final thoughts. 1, after the crisis, after the recovery, after everybody's gone home, they'll still be paralyzed, they'll still be childless, they'll still be blind, and they're going to have to embrace the future with a major shift of perspective. They need to be able to say, this may not be Kansas, Toto, but we can build a new life here. We can build a new life in these conditions. This may mean getting a whole new paradigm for understanding self and understanding relationships and understanding the future. It may mean that I no longer think of myself in the major terms that define myself. Now, if I might speak personally just a minute. You've alluded to the fact that I've recently become a senior professor. For 22 years, I taught in a fine institution. I'd worked myself up to being chair of the department, associate dean, director of graduate programs. Things were going great when suddenly all of the system came crashing in for a variety of reasons. I remember really as I was writing all of this and researching this on my book, thinking, a job change isn't even on the list of the top 10 tragedies. Why am I feeling like this? It's really not. I'll pray that I not become bitter. I'll redefine life. I'll have my community support. I walked through these steps. And then I got to the one of redefining your sense of self with a new paradigm, and it hit me by surprise. My daughter and I, we're going to fly back out to Kansas where I'm consulting and starting a counseling center for another church out there, and she was going back to see some friends. And we were getting the tickets, and the most unlikely question came up. And they said, where do you work and what's your profession? And I said, I'm a counselor at St. Matthew's Counseling Center. And Ashley turned to me and said, Dad, you're a professor. Tell them that. I said, sweetheart, I'm no longer a professor. And it dawned on me that that was one of the hardest things in all of the change, because I was changing my identity that had been there since I was 30 years old. No longer a father. I'm no longer a mother. I'm no longer a husband. I'm no longer a wife. I'm no longer an able-bodied person. Fill in whatever helps define you. And imagine losing that, and then you know the task that you have in ministering to these traumatized families, when at the heart of what's happened, it has attacked their sense of self. But ultimately, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a brother, a sister, an able-bodied person, I'm a champion, I'm a hero. All of those things should not be our definition of self to begin with. I am a person of worth, created in the image of God, is the ultimate definition of self. And we can say that to any traumatized person. We can stop feeling sorry for ourselves, and we can build a new life here, whatever form it's going to take. Then, and only then, do the real faith questions begin to surface. I haven't talked about the role of faith early on in struggling with reshaping their theology, but I think once there's a new sense of self, then there can be a new sense of faith. The majority of trauma victims in my study reported feeling closer to God after they had recovered. They described a shift in their view of God, but one subgroup, 5 persons in the same profession, said, I feel further from God after the trial. Guess what? They were all 5 clergy persons. When I began to talk to them about it, I realized that they had tried to make the faith statements up front, rather than wrestling through the process and then looking at what had happened in their faith. They had worked so hard to preserve one narrow God had felt absent from them in the midst of the process. And I went back and studied, and I think persons, faith perspective, survive the crisis as long as they let the crisis reshape their faith. But if they are bent on letting their faith reshape the crisis, they don't survive. And at the end they say, I'm not supposed to die. One pastor said, I'm even borderline an atheist since my son's death. I never understood. He said, I'm so bitter. He said, I don't want to talk to Christians. He was choosing isolation. It's going to be a long time before he can recover. You see, after the trauma, after the exile, after the return to some new promised land, the real question is, can God grow corn here? That is, after the trauma, after it's all over, the real question is, can I still live with God day in and day out in an everyday life experience? And the answer, praise God, is yes. As you minister through crises and trauma with families, from your own spiritual perspective, my prayer for each of you is that you will be able to walk with them into new faith affirmations and into finding in whatever new life they've found that God indeed is present there. Thank you. May God bless you.